Hi everyone. Today, as always, I will help you fall asleep with scary stories and the sound of rain. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to listen to my new stories. Enjoy listening. I was hurrying home from work. It was already dark and frosty. It was December, after all. Since I worked in one city and lived in another, I had to take the commuter train. To work in the morning, home in the evening. The journey took a little less than an hour. Today was Friday, and my mood was upbeat. Having climbed up to the deserted platform, I began to wait for the commuter train. There was not a soul on the platform. It was located on the outskirts, next to an industrial zone, and as a rule, there were always few people here. But today it was completely empty. Taking out my phone, I began to search for something on the internet. The commuter train crept up somehow quietly, and I was pleasantly surprised that it had arrived 5 minutes earlier. This does not happen often. This fact only added to the positive mood, and I literally jumped into its wide open doors. I was already eager to warm up in a warm carriage. It was 25 degrees with a huge minus outside. As soon as I entered the warm carriage, I felt my mood level jump by another 10 points. Besides, the carriage was completely empty. Sit wherever you want. Beautiful. I'll be home soon, and ahead of me are 2 days off, for which I have a ton of plans. As soon as I sat down more comfortably, the train started moving and began to pick up speed. I touched the internet, but no such luck. My phone suddenly lost all connection with the outside world. I just didn't expect such a nasty thing from my trusty Samsung. 2 SIM cards, and both are not online. I rebooted the phone, the same picture. Oh well, this minor annoyance couldn't spoil my mood. I took out my headphones, turned on an audiobook and leaned back while waiting for the conductor. A monotonous voice droned in the headphones, and I fell asleep. When I woke up, a thought flashed through my head. Had I passed by? My heart started pounding, and I immediately looked at the time. I had been traveling for about an hour. My station should be here now. But the train was still rushing along, without slowing down, and outside the windows there was night, the moon, and a forest. An endless forest to the right and to the left. There was still not a soul in the carriage. I felt uneasy. I looked at the electronic board with a running line, but it was empty. I looked at my phone again. There was still no connection. I thought, let me go forward along the carriages and ask people what the last stop was. I put the phone with the headphones in my pocket, and went to the next carriage. It was empty. I walked on. I must have passed 5 semi-dark carriages, not a soul. My gaze fell on the emergency button. I went up to it, and pressed it. A wild screeching and hissing sound hit my eardrums from the speakers, and I jumped back in surprise. Thoughts were rushing around in my head, and I didn't know what to do. I looked at the emergency brake. It was torn off. My right hand went up to scratch the back of my head, and then I remembered that I had a hat. I had left it on the seat in the carriage I had entered at the station. I hurriedly moved back to get my hat. Along the way, I noticed that the emergency brakes were torn off everywhere. This only made me more anxious. But if I had known what awaited me on the way to my carriage, I would not have gone back at all. But I didn't know. Anyway, I made my way through 3 carriages towards the back, entered the next one, and it entered the carriage from the opposite end. When I saw it, I froze right in the doorway. I broke out in a sweat, and my legs almost gave way, and a wheezing sound escaped from my throat. It was of enormous height and width, and it was slowly walking towards me on enormous bare feet. The shape of its feet were human, only the size. The size of each foot was the size of a child's sled. There was one dusty lamp burning in the carriage. Like the moon, it illuminated a mystical picture that seemed like a dream to me. The creature's huge hands, with palms like excavator buckets, reached the floor. His fingers were as thick as my hand, and he had to stoop to walk along the height of the carriage. His huge belly hung over his pants, This mutant was dressed in a conductor's uniform, which was also huge in size, but was bursting at the seams from the body pushing it apart. The uniform was dirty and torn. A large, battered leather conductor's bag hung over his shoulder on a strap. But the scariest thing was what was sitting on his shoulders. It was a huge bald head, covered in scars, without eyeballs, with eyelids sewn up with a mattress seam. The mouth was so big that an average watermelon could fit in it entirely. The monster walked slowly forward, while feeling each seat with its big hands. He carefully checked every space in the carriage. He felt under the seats themselves, and even the luggage racks. All the while, he muttered something inarticulate, snorted, grunted, and wheezed. Sometimes you could make out growling words. "Show your ticket." And then, HRRRAAA, why, ticket AAA, show. Then the carriage shook, and my numbness passed. I quickly turned around and rushed back. I ran through 10 carriages, or maybe even 15, until the figure of a sitting man flashed by to my right. My brain did not immediately react to this information, and my legs did not obey the order to stop due to fear, so I rushed to the vestibule and there, by an effort of will, I was able to stop my legs. I turned around and looked at the man. The man was dozing by the window approximately in the middle of the car. I jumped up to him to wake him up, and when I grabbed him by the shoulder, he woke up. "Let's run from here, otherwise we are finished. There is a mutant there," I shouted excitedly. "Hey, it was you and the conductor who met," the passenger grinned bitterly. I was somehow taken aback by his calmness. I opened my mouth to say something, but all the words in my head were completely confused. "Don't worry, sit down, I'll tell you everything now," the stranger suggested. His calm tone had an effect on me. My cottony legs bent, and I sat down opposite my interlocutor, and he continued, "There are 10 to 12 cars between us and the conductor. As you probably noticed, the conductor is blind and moves very slowly. It takes him about 20 minutes to feel the entire car, the vestibule, and squeeze into the next one. This means that he will get to our car in about 3 hours. So, I have time to somehow explain to you what is going on here." "What is going on here?" I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "My name is Georgy Alexandrovich. You can just call me Uncle Zora. I am a passenger of a phantom electric train, and now you are too." I caught my breath and looked at my fellow traveler. He was twice my age, about 60 years old, intelligent looking, with a small graying beard, a slightly rumpled dark hat on his head, and he was dressed in a dark coat, which also looked a little rumpled. "Why did you call the train a ghost train, and when will my station be?" I continued asking, choosing the most pressing questions from those swarming in my head. "Your station will not be. This train is in another dimension relative to our world," Uncle Zora said sympathetically and continued, "It will be difficult for you to understand all this now, but I will try to explain. The situation is this: you and I ended up in a parallel dimension. This train sometimes stops at stations and picks up passengers. Moreover, it picks up passengers from ours, that dimension, to this parallel one. It is always only one passenger, and it is impossible to exit it back into our world." "How so?" I asked incredulously. "Look out the window." "What do you see?" he said. "It's dark there," I answered. "That's right," my interlocutor confirmed. "It's always night in this world. And the electric train rushes through the endless winter taiga. There are trees on both sides. An endless ocean of pine trees. And frost. I've been traveling for over a month now. Although the concept of time is very conditional here, and nothing changes outside the window. Only occasionally there are stations, abandoned, deserted, in the endless taiga. And after the electric train makes a stop at them, a new passenger appears. You got on at the last station. And why didn't you get off the electric train at that moment?" I asked. Anyone who gets off it remains at an abandoned station in the frosty taiga of this strange world, and either dies from the cold or, here my interlocutor fell silent. What? Or? I whispered. Have you seen the conductor? He asked. So just imagine what kind of monsters live in this taiga. This electric train is like a check valve. It lets people from our world into its world. But how to get back I don't know. It all seemed like some kind of delirium, or a cruel joke. This evening I got on the electric train to go home, and ended up God knows where. The connection is down. I can't get off. But there must be some way out. Listen, if you walk forward along the train's movement, you can reach the locomotive, and that's where the drivers are. I began to reason. It's futile, my companion interrupted me. Firstly, I'm afraid to even imagine what the drivers look like here, and secondly, the electric train is endless, or rather, beginningless. How can this be? I wondered. Don't forget, my friend, you and I are in another world. The laws of our world don't apply here. I've been moving forward along the carriages for over a month. The conductor is hurrying me on. In short, it has no beginning, and it ends right behind the conductor. When he passes the next carriage, it immediately disappears, as if it dissolves into thin air. And who is this conductor? I asked. One of the natives of this world, he explained. This world is inhabited by mutants, each of whom is sharpened for a specific task. In addition to the conductor, there are road workers, cashiers at the station ticket offices, and even law enforcement officers. They are all extremely aggressive, and we are just food for them. I saw how the conductor ate Herman. He grabbed him with his huge hand like a pie, first bit off his head, and then ate all of Herman without a trace. Even now, when I remember, my legs give way. What Herman? I exhaled. Herman became a passenger a few days after me. Uncle Zora began to tell. I measure the days with my wristwatch. Because there is no sun here. And then Herman came up with a theory that you can leave the train if you end up behind the conductor. And Herman decided to hide under the seat, hoping that the conductor was blind and would not find him. But the conductor found him. I tried to dissuade Herman, Uncle Zora lamented, but he did not listen to me. And I stood in the vestibule and watched. And when the conductor grabbed him, then that crunch of the skull. In general, it was a terrible sight. After what I saw, I probably ran for 20 carriages. I still could not calm down. I still have goosebumps. Uncle Zora fell silent, and I also did not know what to say. I tried to build some sensible picture of what was happening to me. But it was not easy. My brain did not contain the beginningless electric train. I could not understand how I penetrated into another world and what to do with all this. Aren't you hungry? Uncle Zora asked in a fatherly way. His question pulled me out of the chaos of my thoughts, and I felt that I was ravenously hungry. Oh, just a little. I was embarrassed. Uncle Zora pulled out a sports bag from under the bench and began to take out packages. Here's some chicken in foil, bread, tomatoes, a cucumber. A 1.5-liter bottle of soda, he listed. Where did you get the food from? I was surprised. After all, you've been here for a long time. This is another strange thing about this train. He began to explain, unwrapping the chicken. The thing is that as we move along the cars, we find different bags with food and water in some of them. They look as if the passenger got off at his station and forgot his luggage. But where these bags actually come from we don't know. It feels like someone doesn't want us to die of hunger here. Are there other passengers here besides us? I asked, chewing the chicken. Yes, Lyolka and Sergei. But they went far ahead. Lyolka once found a note that said that there is a portal in the train through which you can return to our world. An unknown passenger explained in it that this portal is constantly moving forward along the cars. It is somehow synchronized with the conductor, and is always 1,000 cars ahead of him. so they went to look for it. They think that they will find a way out, Uncle Zora said, slicing tomatoes and bread. But I don't think there's any portal, so I'm in any hurry. A huge moon hung in the sky outside the windows, illuminating the endless taiga with a pale, ashen light. The wheels, like the hooves of some mythical horse, rhythmically pounded the railroad. 2 people were eating chicken in the semi-darkness in an empty carriage of a strange, startless electric train that was rushing to an unknown destination across the vastness of an incomprehensible world. It's hard to imagine a more mystical picture, I thought, crunching on a cucumber. It's time for us to move on, Uncle Zora said, glancing at his watch. The conductor will be here soon. Oh, by the way, you still haven't introduced yourself, young man. What's your name? He continued. Valera. And we can call you informally, I replied. Nice to meet you, he groaned, standing up. Come on, Valera, let's get out of here before the conductor gets here. Uncle Zora took his bag and we walked along the empty carriages, away from the conductor. Count the carriages you've passed, and I'll count them, then we'll compare, he said to me. And I started counting on my fingers as we passed each carriage. We passed 7 carriages and in front of the door of the 8th. Uncle Zora stopped abruptly and raised his hand. I understood his gesture and also froze. A second later, he pointed his finger into the twilight space of the carriage in front of us. I looked closely and saw a man lying on the floor. He was lying between the rows of seats, his feet towards us, and he was clutching something white in his right palm. The man was not moving, and only the train rocked him from side to side. From time to time, Uncle Zora began to whisper, "The train presents a carriage with a surprise to the passengers." Surprises can be different, but, as a rule, they are always mortally dangerous. As if an evil experimenter were conducting dangerous experiments on us. At these moments you have to be extremely careful. What are we going to do? I whispered. You stay here, and I'll go and have a look, Uncle Zora quietly commanded. He put the bag on the floor, slowly opened the carriage doors just enough to squeeze through sideways, and stealthily moved toward the figure on the floor. I, ready to come to his aid at any second, remained to watch. Having crept up to the figure lying on the floor, he bent down, then touched him with his hand and a second later abruptly recoiled and sat down on the seat next to him. Then he called me with a gesture. I cautiously approached. This is Sergei, Uncle Zora said mournfully. He's dead. He bent down and pulled a piece of paper out of Sergei's palm. It was a note from Lyoka. I still don't understand what happened, Lyoka wrote in his note. Sergei said that he wanted to, pardon me, take a leak and stayed in the vestibule, and I went to the next carriage. I waited for him for about 10 minutes, then went after him. But he was gone. I walked back 3 more carriages. Empty. I thought that he had decided to come back to you, and I didn't look for him anymore. I moved forward in search of the portal, and after 14 cars I see him on the floor, dead. No signs of violence. But how did he end up ahead of me? Almost 10 cars. Uncle Zora, be careful. Damn, what should we do with the body now? There's nowhere to bury it. And it seems inconvenient to leave it like this. Maybe we should burn it? Cremation is like a funeral, I suggested, and let the whole car burn to ashes. What do we have to lose? No way. Don't you dare set anything on fire. Uncle Zora got worried. We already tried to burn the car. We thought we'd set it on fire right in front of the conductor, and if the conductor burned in it, then we'd end up in our dimension. But it wasn't that easy. As soon as they started making a fire out of the seats, a fireman immediately appeared. He materialized somewhere in the vestibule on the conductor's side. A monster, I tell you, no worse than a conductor, only sighted and wearing a helmet. And he has a boat hook and a fire extinguisher. We almost dropped bricks when we saw him. And he put out the fire with a fire extinguisher, boat hook at the ready, and ran after us, roaring like a wounded bull. Kicked down the doors between the cars. I don't know how many cars we ran from him. And when I fell down without any strength, I thought, I'm done for. But he disappeared as suddenly as he appeared. In general, I don't advise messing around with fire here. I see you can't mess around with it much. I was impressed by the story. Whose luggage is this? I pointed my finger at a dark backpack on the floor, under one of the seats. I don't know, let's take a look, Uncle Zora suggested. I put the backpack on the seat, opened the zipper, and we began to examine the contents. There were a few boiled eggs, sliced smoked sausage, some bread, a couple of apples and a thermos with hot tea. In the inner pocket of the backpack we found some money, about 2,000 rubles, some receipts, keys and a ticket for this electric train. And then, seeing this ticket, I had an idea. Uncle Zora, the conductor, asked for a ticket. Let's try to show him this ticket. Then we will find ourselves on the other side of the conductor and will be able to get into our world. Well, first of all, we only have one ticket, Uncle Zora began to reason. And secondly, it's dangerous. What if the conductor doesn't like something? He'll gobble it up and not ask your name. We should experiment with this ticket first, but at a safe distance, and then we both looked at Sergei's body. After all, when the conductor finds him on the floor and without a ticket, he'll gobble it up anyway, and we won't be able to hide it anywhere anyway. Let's sit Seryoga down on the seat and put this ticket in his hand, and we'll watch what the conductor does, Uncle Zora suggested. I nodded silently, and that's what we did. Seryoga looked like a sleeping passenger. We sat him by the window, facing the tail of the train right at the entrance to the car. The ticket we found in the backpack was put into his right hand. Uncle Zora and I went to the front of the carriage and waited for the conductor, passing the time with conversation. Uncle Zora, why was all the food in the backpack fresh and even the tea in the thermos hot? I asked. It's always like this on this train. All the luggage we found in it looks like some absent-minded passenger just forgot it, he replied. Damn it. I feel like some kind of rabbit that is being experimented on and fed so it doesn't die of hunger, I lamented. I wish I knew who this evil genius is who is mocking us like this. There is no genius. This person just doesn't know much even about the world he lives in, Uncle Zora said. And what can we say about the laws that reign in neighboring worlds? We must be able to adapt, he continued. We must try to understand what is going on here. To understand the rules of the game, so to speak. And then we might find a way out. Some time passed, and we heard the slamming of doors between the cars and realized that the conductor had reached our car. It was very unpleasant and scary to be in the same car with him. So Uncle Zora and I went out into the vestibule and began to watch what was happening through the glass of the closed doors. It was calmer that way. We saw how the conductor, muttering some nonsense, squeezed into the car and began to carefully probe the entire space. He ran his huge paw over the seat where Seryoga's body was sitting and felt his hand with the ticket. He carefully took the ticket, then took some kind of device out of his bag and stuck the ticket in it. A red light came on the device and a long, unpleasant sound was heard. The conductor began to yell excitedly, grabbed Seryoga's body and bit off its head in one fell swoop. I threw up right on the glass we were watching through. Uncle Zora grabbed my hand and started to lead me away from the conductor. The experiment failed. The conductor's machine does not recognize tickets from our world. We were overcome with despair mixed with disappointment. And besides, fear was urging us to get as far away from the conductor as possible. At first we walked very quickly. We didn't count the carriages. But then fatigue took its toll, and we made a stop. The carriages were different. Some were old, dirty, and rusty. They smelled unpleasant, and you didn't want to stop in them. Others looked quite new and clean. We sat down in one of them. Let's have some tea, Valerie, wheezed the out-of-breath Uncle Zora, taking out of his bag the thermos that we found in the backpack and a couple of candies. The lid of the thermos also served as a glass, and a plastic bowl was put inside. Thus, the thermos was designed for 2 people. I drank from the lid glass, and Uncle Zora from the bowl. Uncle Zor, you were talking about some law enforcement officers, is that the local police? Yeah. Something like that, he said, sipping his tea. I haven't seen them myself, Lyoka told me. He showed up here before me. So, there were 3 of them, Lyoka himself, Seryoga, and Stasik the half-homeless. Stasik had lived here long before Lyoka and Seryoga. They say he liked it here. In our world, he didn't have a place to live, but here he had free food, a roof over his head. He even managed to make beer here from various fruits and candies that he found in his bags. One day they found a note. It said that the patrol could be called to the carriage if you pressed the call button and, ignoring the noise, shouted the phrase, "We have an emergency in the carriage." And then it was said that it was better not to do this, because 2 duty officers would show up and drag off the first person they came across, and you would never see him again. And then it was useless to resist. They were incredibly strong, and they looked so bad that their knees would buckle. When Lyoka read the note out loud, Stasik started laughing and showing off. Like it was all a lie about the duty officers. I pressed those buttons 100 times and didn't see anyone. Stasik was really tipsy from his beer, and he started swearing loudly, like he didn't give a damn about any cops, that he could wipe them all out with one hand, and stuff like that. Then, according to Lyoka, Stasik ran up to the button, pressed it and yelled, "We have an emergency in the car." A grinding and hissing sound came out of the speakers. But Stasik didn't care. He was yelling at the top of his lungs, "We have an emergency in the carriage!" Lyoka said that he and Seryoga wanted to drag him away from the button. But then something happened that made them stay rooted to the spot. 2 men burst in from the vestibule. One was huge, up to the ceiling, the other up to his waist. Their faces were covered in terrible scars. Both were wearing the remains of their uniforms. Their blue shirts were tattered and covered in brown stains. The big man had such huge arms that his sleeves were torn. Both were barefoot, but they had shoulder straps on. They were growling like bears. Their eyes were red and wild. They grabbed Stasik and started beating him up, knocked out all his teeth, smashed his face until it bled. Then they twisted his arms, put handcuffs on him and dragged him by the legs back where they came from. Lyoka said that he and Seryoga were petrified by what they saw. For a long time after that, they were afraid to go further along the cars. But the conductor urged them on from behind, and they had to keep moving. They hadn't seen Stasik since then, and the bloody trail from him ended in the passage between the cars. It was as if all 3 of them had simply disappeared there. "Serious matters," I muttered, not knowing what to say. Then we noticed that the train was slowing down. "Looks like there's a station coming," Uncle Zora said thoughtfully, looking out the window. "And maybe another passenger." "What, aren't there passengers at every station?" I was surprised. "No," he answered. "Sometimes the train stands at the station for quite a long time, as if waiting for its prey. But it doesn't always manage to snatch another poor fellow from our world. What if we get off at the station and talk the passenger out of getting on?" I blurted out, "You're naive, Valera. You won't see the passenger, don't forget, we're in different realities. He's at the station in our native world. And you and I, who knows where?" Meanwhile, the train crept up to the station and finally stopped. The doors hissed and clanked open. Something unintelligible grunted from the speakers. The station was a 2-story building with knocked-out, dark windows. The empty, night platform was lit by a couple of dim lanterns. In the wall of the building, there was a single unbroken, barred window, in which a dim light was burning, and above it were the letters KS. Further on, The letters either fell off or were never there. But it was clear that this was the ticket office. The atmosphere of desolation and semi-darkness was downright mystical. "Can I go out to scout?" I asked. "Yes, I can. But when you hear a voice from the speakers, immediately enter the carriage. Otherwise, you'll stay here forever." "What's in the building?" I persisted. "Better not go there," Uncle Zora warned. "Such creatures live there that you won't be happy about. By the way, if you see anyone on the street, run as fast as you can into the carriage. As a rule, they don't come here. It's not like they're supposed to. But if they catch you on the street, they'll eat you." "Stop making things worse, Uncle Zora. I'm scared to go out now." "Of course," Uncle Zora said meaningfully. "I never go out myself." An eternal frosty night hung over this strange world. But I decided to get out of the carriage anyway, because I had a plan. I decided to go to the ticket office and try to buy a ticket. As I got out of the carriage, I felt a strong frost. Strangely, there was no snow anywhere. I only just now noticed this. Looking around, I saw carriages on both sides, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. "Is it really that endless?" I thought, slowly moving towards the ticket office. The ticket window was cloudy, but the silhouette of the cashier was visible behind the dusty glass. It was impossible to get a detailed look at the inhabitant of the ticket office, and I didn't really want to. At the bottom of the window I saw a rusty tray pulled out onto the street. Having thrown a 500 note in there, I pushed it back into the ticket office and said, "2 tickets," and showed 2 fingers out the window in case the ticket office couldn't hear me well. The silhouette in the window began to fuss, and suddenly the tray with the 500 note was knocked back, and an inarticulate roar and some kind of swearing was heard from behind the window. I jumped back in surprise. My heart was pounding. I looked at the doorway in the building. I felt uneasy at the thought that one of its inhabitants would hear the noise and come out onto the platform. But everything worked out. Carefully taking my 500 from the tray, I turned my head towards the carriage. And I saw some movement. Sneaking closer, I made out the outline of a figure under the carriage. Or rather, only its back part. Standing on all fours and sticking his head under the carriage, there was some huge guy in a dirty orange vest fiddling around. Next to him on the platform lay a hammer and some other tool. Under the carriage, I could hear his dissatisfied grumbling and metallic knocking. Probably he was fixing some kind of breakdown in the lower part of the carriage. Probably the local mechanic. And how come he didn't notice me? I thought with horror. I wanted to immediately dive into the carriage before the mechanic spotted me. But then I saw that a red ID card was sticking out of the back pocket of his dirty trousers. Probably a railroad employee's ID card flashed through my head. And a plan immediately formed. I snuck up behind the mechanic, abruptly snatched his ID from his pocket, and rushed to the carriage doors. His reaction was simply animalistic, and he immediately rushed after me with a roar. Having lost precious seconds climbing the iron steps of the carriage, I already felt in the vestibule that the mutant was catching up with me. Having pushed open the doors to the carriage on the left, where Uncle Zora was waiting for me, I rushed towards the tail of the train. Before the doors had time to close behind me, I felt the mechanic grab my leg. Having fallen to the floor, I was able to grab the leg of the first seat. Standing on the platform, the mechanic reached out to me with his incredibly long arms, and this despite the fact that I was already in the carriage. Uncle Zora, with a frightened face, rushed to my aid. He grabbed me by the clothes and began to pull me with all his might into the carriage. The situation had reached a stalemate. The conductor was inexorably approaching us from the rear of the train, and I was being pulled forward by, without exaggeration, the hydraulic hand of the mechanic. Our forces were not equal, and Uncle Zora and I understood that the mechanic was about to pull me out of the car like a cork from a bottle. We resisted with all our might. Uncle Zora shouted at me to hold on. But my hands straightened my numb fingers one by one. We looked at each other in horror and mentally said goodbye. Suddenly I remembered the emergency call button. With some incredible effort, I reached for it, and pressing it, screamed at the top of my lungs. An emergency in our car. An emergency in our car. And then the real horror began. A squad of 2 mutants burst into the vestibule, and the first person they caught was the mechanic, who had invaded the train up to his waist and was dragging me out of the car by the leg. A second later I heard the crunch of breaking bones and the mechanic's wild scream. A bloodbath had begun in the vestibule. The car was jumping as if a herd of elephants were dancing on its roof. These 2 goblins had pulled the mechanic into the vestibule and were simply dismantling him for parts. The growling and screaming were so loud that it was ear-splitting. Uncle Zora, out of breath, pulled me into the middle of the car. Turning around, I saw that the mechanic's severed arm was still holding my leg and was dragging behind me, leaving a bloody trail. And the rest of him was flying around the vestibule under the blows of the guards, knocking out the glass in the car doors. We, numb, watched what was happening. Suddenly the mechanic fell silent, and through the broken windows we saw how the 2 busily dragged his remains into the passage between the cars. Exhausted, we sat on the floor of the car. The speakers again blared an inarticulate but expressive announcement. The train hissed as it closed its doors and continued its endless voyage across the vastness of a strange world. Valera, what the hell did you hook this mutant for? Uncle Zora croaked angrily, catching his breath. I took the freshly stolen ID out of my pocket and gave it to Uncle Zora. Well, what do you need it for? He continued, clutching his heart. I'll show it to the ticket office and get a couple of local tickets so we can get out of this damn train, I wheezed. The theory is certainly interesting, colleague, he sarcastically. But because of this, they almost tore your head off. Oh well. Uncle Jer. Everything worked out. But now, at the next station, I'll get tickets for us. I'm already afraid to imagine how this will look, he continued to taunt, returning my card to me. I grinned and opened the ID to examine this trophy. It was as caricatured as everything else in this incomprehensible world. The even lines consisted of a mixture of Cyrillic and Latin letters. Upper and lower case letters were arranged in a random order. It was impossible to read anything, but everything was serious, even the owner's photo with a large round seal. The wrinkled face in the photo was disgusting. The eyes, one of which was higher than the other, expressed a complete lack of intelligence. The lipless mouth grinned with large, yellow horse teeth. 2 slits instead of a nose and huge ears completed the picture. Uncle Jer, do you think the cashier will notice that it's not me in the photo? Come on. You're just like twins. Just the same face, he said, laughing hoarsely. After this joke, we absolutely could not get up from the floor. The adrenaline left the vessels of our bodies, and we were covered with nervous laughter. We laughed until we had colic, until we cried, rolling on the floor. When we had finished laughing, I tried to free my leg from the mechanic's hand that had grabbed it. But it was not easy. The grip of his fingers was literally dead. His hand had been torn straight from his shoulder. 2 meters long and very heavy, it hung on my leg like a weight. Apparently a spasm had closed the huge fingers in an iron grip, and the dead hand did not want to let go of my leg. Cut the tendons, Uncle Zora said, handing me his knife. I took the knife and began to cut the back of the dead palm. The fingers began to weaken one by one, and I was finally able to free my leg. In the semi-darkness of the carriage, the mechanic's huge hand lay on the floor. Its hand, like a predatory spider, swayed in time with the movement of the train, and we wanted to leave this carriage as soon as possible. It seemed that the hand would come to life and grab someone by the throat. Uncle Zora. Let's get out of here, I suggested. I really don't want to wait for the conductor. He silently took his bag, and we carefully walked around the hand to the vestibule. Opening the doors, we saw a nightmarish picture. The vestibule was covered in the mechanic's blood. It was dripping from the ceiling, flowing down the walls, and knocked out teeth. Some bloody scraps and a huge eye were lying on the floor. Shards of broken glass crunched under our feet. There were dents from blows on the walls and doors. What we saw chilled us to the bone. We became afraid to go on. What if those two were waiting for us in the next vestibule? Uncle Zora entered the passage between the cars. The bloody trail ended there. He slightly opened the door of the vestibule of the neighboring car. It was empty. In the car, nothing suspicious either. "Valera, we need to go through 10 or 12 carriages so that we can calmly have a bite to eat and take a nap," Uncle Zora said without stopping. "No problem," I answered, limping. After the mechanic's iron grip, my leg ached, but I was ready to endure it, just to get as far away from that bloody carriage and the approaching conductor. After walking 3 carriages, we found a large plastic bag and a handbag. The bag contained expensive sausage, cognac, a 1.5-liter bottle of cola, fruit, chocolate, and a can of olives. A pink handbag lay nearby, and on it glittered a label of 3 Latin letters, NGA. Inside was a standard women's set. Nothing interesting, except for the stun gun that we had taken with us. Uncle Zora put the found products in his bag, and we moved on. After another 9 carriages, we decided to make a stop. We got out the products and had a small feast with cognac. Then fatigue took over, and we dozed off. I woke up because Uncle Zora was shaking my shoulder. "What happened, Uncle Zora?" I jumped up. "The train stopped," he said. "Another station." I looked out the window. In the darkness on the empty platform stood a concrete ticket booth, and next to it, under a rusty, standing on the platform, the mechanic reached out to me with his incredibly long arms, and this despite the fact that I was already in the carriage. Uncle Zora, with a frightened face, rushed to my aid. He grabbed me by the clothes and began to pull me with all his might into the carriage. The situation had reached a stalemate. The conductor was inexorably approaching us from the rear of the train, and I was being pulled forward by, without exaggeration, the hydraulic hand of the mechanic. Our forces were not equal, and Uncle Zora and I understood that the mechanic was about to pull me out of the car like a cork from a bottle. We resisted with all our might. Uncle Zora shouted at me to hold on, but my hands straightened my numb fingers one by one. We looked at each other in horror and mentally said goodbye. Suddenly I remembered the emergency call button. With some incredible effort, I reached for it, and pressing it, screamed at the top of my lungs. "An emergency in our car! An emergency in our car!" And then the real horror began. A squad of 2 mutants burst into the vestibule, and the first person they caught was the mechanic, who had invaded the train up to his waist and was dragging me out of the car by the leg. A second later I heard the crunch of breaking bones and the mechanic's wild scream. A bloodbath had begun in the vestibule. The car was jumping as if a herd of elephants were dancing on its roof. These 2 goblins had pulled the mechanic into the vestibule and were simply dismantling him for parts. The growling and screaming were so loud that it was ear-splitting. Uncle Zora, out of breath, pulled me into the middle of the car. Turning around, I saw that the mechanic's severed arm was still holding my leg and was dragging behind me, leaving a bloody trail. And the rest of him was flying around the vestibule under the blows of the guards, knocking out the glass in the car doors. We, numb, watched what was happening. Suddenly the mechanic fell silent, and through the broken windows we saw how the 2 busily dragged his remains into the passage between the cars. Exhausted, we sat on the floor of the car. The speakers again blared an inarticulate but expressive announcement. The train hissed as it closed its doors and continued its endless voyage across the vastness of a strange world. "Valera, what the hell did you hook this mutant for?" Uncle Zora croaked angrily, catching his breath. I took the freshly stolen ID out of my pocket and gave it to Uncle Zora. "Well, what do you need it for?" he continued, clutching his heart. "I'll show it to the ticket office and get a couple of local tickets so we can get out of this damn train," I wheezed. "The theory is certainly interesting, colleague," he sarcastically. "But because of this, they almost tore your head off. Oh well. Uncle Jer. Everything worked out. But now, at the next station, I'll get tickets for us. I'm already afraid to imagine how this will look," he continued, his inarticulate muttering inspired some kind of quiet horror. I wanted to run away immediately. But having pulled myself together, I took the electric shocker from Uncle Zora just in case and went to the middle of the carriage. Holding out my ticket, I stood there, ready to run away from here if I failed. Uncle Zora stood about 5 steps behind me, equally ready to leave the carriage. We understood that the conductor would not run after us, but his inhuman reaction and long-armed scoops forced us to be on our guard. Feeling the space of the carriage, he slowly advanced on me. In his muttering, I several times made out the phrase, "Show your ticket." Finally, he felt my outstretched hand with the ticket, carefully took it, and reached into his bag for his control device. My heart was pounding at a terrible speed. I squeezed the electric shocker in my hand and prepared to jump back if the nasty buzzer in his device began to howl. Having taken out his strange machine, he shoved my ticket into it. The machine purred contentedly, beeped briefly, and a green light came on. The conductor took my ticket out of the machine, muttered the word "order," and handed me the whole ticket. I took the ticket and sat down on the seat. The conductor, feeling the carriage, moved on to Uncle Zora. Uncle Zora, seeing that the tickets fit, calmed down a little and also sat down on the couch. I watched what was happening from behind this mutant, but was afraid to say a word, so as not to scare away my luck. Uncle Zora, just like me, successfully passed the check, and the conductor began to squeeze into the vestibule. Having felt it, climbed into the next carriage. For some time, Uncle Zora and I sat in our seats, as if dumbfounded and could not understand what to do next. Our carriage did not disappear anywhere, nothing changed. The electric train continued to travel through the night taiga. Then Uncle Zora stood up and silently came up to me. He looked at me, and I at him. "What next?" I whispered for some reason. "I don't know," he answered. "Let's check the previous carriage, maybe it's gone missing?" I suggested. And we went to check. When we entered the vestibule of the neighboring carriage and made sure that it had not disappeared, we froze in surprise. The light was on in the carriage, and there were people in it. A second wave of numbness washed over Uncle Zora and me. We stood silently, rooted to the spot in the vestibule, and looked through the glass in the doors at the passengers. There were not many of them. A young couple with a girl running around the carriage, a serious man with a briefcase, and 2 grannies chatting animatedly. I don't know how long we stood like that, but Uncle Zora was the first to come to his senses. "I don't understand," he drawled. "Have we come back? And why hasn't our carriage disappeared?" It was clear that a bunch of questions were swarming in his head. His face expressed some kind of distrust of what was happening, as if he suspected that all of this was some kind of another experiment, and the passengers in the carriage were not real. Then he slowly turned around and went into our carriage, opened the doors to the vestibule, and we saw that the light was on there too, and passengers were riding. Just a minute ago, it had been an empty and dark carriage of the ghost train, and now there were passengers there, riding as if nothing had happened. "Valera, our carriage has disappeared. Another one has taken its place." "Well, yes," I answered. "It turns out that this is how it happens. You have to go to another carriage to get into our world." Uncle Zora stepped into the carriage, and I followed him. We slowly walked down the aisle, looking at the passengers, then into another carriage, then into a third. Staring at the people, we looked ridiculous. and probably everyone took us for some kind of crazy homeless people. We gradually realized that we had managed to escape from the eerie world of the ghost train. The people around were real. Everyone was going about their business. Uncle Zora turned to me, tears in his eyes. Apparently, in that dark world, he lost faith that he would ever be able to return. "We did it," he said and hugged me like a father. I hugged him too. A wave of joy washed over us, our legs became weak. And we sat down on the seat. Our faces were shining with happiness. And the train began to slow down, and a female voice announced that the stop was called the 666th kilometer, and that the next station was Liski. We did not yet know where we were, because each of us entered the ghost train from different cities, but apparently it was possible to get off it only here, on platform 666th kilometer. This was where the return portal was. It was still dark outside, but this was clearly a different train, and now we knew where we were going. This was our world. His fingers, unaccustomed to writing, clutched a pen that wrote letters on the first page of a thick notebook. "My name is Alexei. I am a passenger on a ghost train." It was difficult to write in the poorly lit train car, but the man had long wanted to start a diary. It was supposed to be a kind of instruction, or even a set of laws by which this world lives. He had come up with this idea after reading notes from unknown passengers that he came across from time to time in different train cars. Hints and useful warnings in these messages on scraps of paper often saved the life of even such an experienced train inhabitant as Alexei. The man raised his head and looked carefully towards the tail of the train car. The dim lighting did not allow him to see anything in the vestibule, so he had to rely on his hearing. Some noise was heard through the clatter of the wheels of the train rushing through the night. "The conductor will soon reach this car, and I will have no choice but to climb forward," flashed through his head. Rising to his feet, Alexei went to the vestibule door that led towards the head of the train and looked through the glass in bewilderment. There was practically no car ahead. Or rather, there used to be one. But now what was left of it was rushing there, furiously drumming its crooked wheels along the rails. And there was very little left. A mangled platform with huge holes in the floor through which sleepers flashed. Short and sharp stumps of legs from torn-out seats, sticking out like teeth along the perimeter, and a piece of the left wall, which was flapping in the wind like an ugly flag made of sheet metal with torn edges. Everything looked as if the car had been torn apart by a powerful explosion. Traces of soot and melted steel suggested exactly this version. Once upon a time, an unsuspecting Alexei entered a strange train that tore him from the world of people and carried him into the frosty darkness of another reality. Since then, the man lost track of time, because in the world of the train there was eternal night. The ominous train regularly replenished the number of passengers. First Stas appeared, then Sergei and Uncle Zora. But now, apparently, Alexei is left alone. Surviving in this train is not an easy task. It was even more difficult to destroy the conductor, who seemed to embody the inevitability of impending death. Blind Doom, for whom there were no names or ranks, took the appearance of a terrible mutant and methodically cleared the carriages of all living things. The thought of finishing off this creature became an obsession. Looking at the remains of the carriage ahead, Alexei imagined how he would crawl over it into the next, intact one, and from there, through the glass of the vestibule door, he would watch as the blind conductor flew at full speed right under the wheels of this damned electric train. After all, even for a sighted person to get over a torn-up carriage at such a speed is oh so difficult. And the terrible frost with the wind and the stingy moonlight made this task practically impossible. That is why Alexei delayed the upcoming crossing. Yes, there was still hope for the station. If the electric train stopped, he could simply run across the ground and enter a normal carriage. But the station had been gone for a long time. So at some point Alexei realized that he would have to overcome this obstacle on the move, and began to prepare. For a dangerous sortie, he needed the appropriate equipment, otherwise he could freeze his hands and face. And for outerwear, he only had an old sweater and some well-worn pants. The man took an elastic bandage out of his backpack and began to wrap it around his head, and then his palms. After that, he examined his improvised mittens through a narrow slit for his eyes and, deciding to test his grip, began to collect his belongings in his backpack. The electric train, which had no beginning, rumbled through the endless taiga expanses of a strange cold world, where eternal night reigned. From the sky, the moon of incredible size jealously looked after it, and the conductor was approaching the semi-dark carriage with the man in bandages. Having put on his backpack, Alexei again approached the door through which he would soon have to exit, and seeing his reflection in the glass, he couldn't resist making a joke. Well, he's just the spitting image of a mummy. Lucky for that bastard that he's blind, otherwise he'd have shit himself if he'd met me. At that moment, the vestibule doors slid open noisily behind him and the conductor's eerie muttering could be heard. Alexei didn't turn around. In the reflection of the glass, he could see a huge figure with a bald head on his shoulders and eyelids sewn up with black thread squeezing into the semi-darkness of the carriage. The man swung the frozen doors open with difficulty, and an icy wind hit him. Having passed the twisted vestibule, he had to get down on all fours and, clinging with his bandaged hands to the remains of the steel structure, begin to move along the jumping platform. First the coupling, then the beams with the surviving fragments of the sheathing. His hands instantly froze, and his fingers did not obey. The wind began to make his eyes water, and Alexei could hardly see anything. The platform was jumping like a mad bull at a rodeo, trying to throw the rider. But if the cowboys only had to stay in the saddle, then Alexei had to crawl, feeling with his frozen hands for the next convenient fragment of the iron structure in order to grab hold more firmly. Any miss could cost him his life. The middle of the platform is a short respite. His lungs are burning, the wind pierces right through, a torn piece of sheathing rattles on the left. He couldn't get up on his knees anymore, they were smashed to the point of bleeding. The only way to go was on his belly. Clinging to another tear in the floor and growling at the top of his voice, the man pulled his body forward, then again and again. It seemed that the wheels of this death cart were square. At times his legs were thrown up so that it took his breath away. Another growl and a pull-up, again and again. His sweater and pants were torn, catching on rusty burrs. A couple more bear-like growls. And here it was the car's coupling. Further on the dented vestibule door. If only he could reach it. What if it jammed from the explosion? A frightening thought suddenly cut through his mind. With his last strength, getting up on his smashed knees, Alexei reached for the handle and pressed. The door swung open. Another jerk beyond all the capabilities of his body, and he was on the vestibule floor. The door slammed shut, and consciousness left his mortally tired body. Tuduk tuduk, tuduk tuduk. A sound was growing from somewhere far away, as if the iron heart of this merciless world was beating. A world that cold-bloodedly ground up everything foreign. How much time had passed? And was there any time here at all? After all, it was always night, always the moon and always the clatter of wheels. Tuduk tuduk, tuduk tuduk. How painful it was to come to. The whole body was burning like fire. Fingers and toes were numb. Eyes did not open because of frozen eyelashes. Somehow opening his eyelids and then pushing the doors apart, Alexei literally crawled from the cold vestibule into the car and climbed onto the seat. His strength was gradually returning, and despite his torn clothes, his body was warming up in the warm car. Goosebumps furiously bit his hands and cheeks, freed from the frayed bandages. The surviving bandage was used to bandage his broken knees. How long was I out cold? And what happened to the conductor? It's a shame I didn't see him fly off the platform. It must have been cool at that speed. After resting a bit more, the man limped back into the vestibule and looked through the glass door at the platform he had managed to cross with such difficulty. No sign of the conductor. The carriage behind the platform was also quiet. Maybe he hasn't arrived yet. We have to wait. We can't miss something like that. After standing in the vestibule for about 15 minutes, Alexei felt that he was freezing. I'll warm up a bit in the carriage and then come back, he thought, turning around and stretching out his hand to the doors. Behind him, he heard a loud click of the door handle and a muttering sound. Sharply turning his head back, Alexei recoiled and froze. The conductor was squeezing into the vestibule from the outside. Despite his enormous size, the mutant had an incredible ability to penetrate the narrowest doors. The process looked creepy, as if a powerful press was pushing a plastic mass through a thin neck with a nasty crack. At the same time, the conductor did not stop mumbling his mantra. The growling voice was distorted when the head, crumpling, passed through the door, which made it even more frightening. The left hand, the size of an excavator bucket, had already straightened out, and, having acquired its shape, immediately began to busily feel the vestibule. Then a bald head with sewn-up eyelids and an inhuman bass voice, from which the air vibrated like jelly, came forward and said, "Your ticket, show me your ticket, why?" His hands searched every corner in search of stowaways, and woe to anyone he caught. Alexei had no choice but to grab his backpack and, limping, leave the carriage. Then the next one, and the next, and the next. In a state of some kind of prostration, he overcame a bunch of carriages, then sat down on the first couch he came across and dozed off. The dreams were disturbing in them, as if in a card index, all the attempts to destroy the conductor that the man had ever made flashed. And despite the fact that they were futile, his brain, even in the arms of Morphus, continued to search for new options for elimination. The conductor is a key figure in this strange world, and his destruction will entail irreversible consequences. What exactly is unknown, but Alexei was sure that these consequences will allow him to find a way out of this terrible reality. He also dreamed of a cat, which Alexei had seen several times at empty stations. Red and brutal, with half of his left ear lost in battles. He was not from here, not from the world of the electric train, the man had no doubt about that. The cat never entered the train, he just sat at the stations and looked at the cars, as if thinking about something. The cat's appearances were always accompanied by one chilling pattern. The ashen pale moon turned red. Like an alarm lamp, it signaled the penetration of a foreign organism into its domain. But this did not bother the red-haired guest, and he appeared time after time at stations that were located hundreds of kilometers from each other. How he managed it, Alexei did not yet understand. The train jerked, and Alexei woke up. The car was new and well lit. The man, despite the aching abrasions, felt a surge of strength after sleeping and looked around. His torn arms and scraped knees were bandaged with the remains of an elastic bandage. His pants and sweater were in tatters. He remembered the tracksuit he had once found in one of the bags that were occasionally found on the train, but he had not taken it with him because of its large size. Now the sports suit would be just right. Anything would be better than striped pants and a torn sweater. After rummaging through his backpack, Alexei took out a wind-up razor and, having wound up the spring, headed to the toilet. He needed to wash himself and wash his wounds. Cars with toilets were rare, so they always included a break for hygiene procedures. Opening the door to the toilet, the man froze in surprise. The interior of the cabin contrasted so strongly with the newness of the car. A dusty and half-dead ceiling lamp tried to illuminate the cramped space. There were yellow cigarette butts lying on the wet floor. The rust had become so wild that it had even spread to the plastic surfaces. The closet looked as if they had tested a time machine in it, which had aged it by 100 years. But three things really struck me. Above the toilet, on the wall, hung a military-style insulated jumpsuit, and underneath it, right on the dirty floor, stood an ice pick. And the cherry on the cake was a drawing made with a lip brush on a mirror. A small circle and 3 arrows entering it from the outside, and an inscription under the drawing. Just 2 words that literally sent an electric shock through Alexei's entire body. Portal in the city. The razor's spring finally straightened out, and the device went silent. The man, as if in a dream, took a step toward the stained sink, above which hung a dusty mirror, and touched the inscription with his finger. It looked completely fresh, as if some joker had managed to leave a message 5 minutes ago, while Alexei was sleeping in the train car. A familiar feeling surfaced somewhere in the depths of consciousness. Many times I had to deal with such gifts, and they meant one thing: as soon as you accept them, a chain of events will be launched, from which it will be impossible to escape. And the final link of this chain, as a rule, did not bring anything good. As if someone was conducting experiments, and Alexei was a guinea pig in them. Often it was necessary to show miracles of ingenuity in order to survive another competition with an unknown genius. But if you do not accept the gift, then another chain will be launched, and it is far from a fact that it will be less cruel. The jumpsuit fits perfectly. The backpack is on the shoulders. The ice axe sits in the hand like a glove. Well, of course. They know a lot about gifts here. The gladiator was ready to meet his fate, and it did not make him languish. The first warning bell was the purple moon. So, there will be a date with the cat. And then everything went even more abruptly. The electric train literally burst onto the bridge. The sound of the wheels, previously absorbed by the forest, now became deafening. The bridge appeared so suddenly that Alexei screamed in surprise, jumping away from the window. However, the opposite window showed exactly the same picture. It seemed to the completely wild man that he had been traveling through the black taiga for an eternity, and saw nothing but trees and abandoned stations. And then suddenly a huge bridge, hanging at a dizzying height, and under it a wide frozen river. It seemed that the electric train was hovering in the air, revealing a stunning panorama in crimson tones. The heart literally jumped out of the chest, but it was impossible to tear your eyes away from the windows. Finally, the opposite bank appeared, and it was not covered with a forest at all. Dark rectangular high-rise buildings stretched as far as the eye could see. The huge dark city was mind-boggling. Alexei was completely stunned by what he saw. He felt like Robinson, who had been unexpectedly snatched from an uninhabited island and thrown into a megalopolis. Not a single window was lit in the buildings, and the moon gave the high-rises an ominous, reddish hue. Having crossed the bridge, the train began to slow down, pulling Alexei's car to a station of such dimensions that the man had never seen in this world. The station was the only more or less illuminated place in the mysterious megalopolis. A frosty breeze was driving some kind of trash across the deserted square. Behind the square towered a massive station building with broken windows, and about 5 half-dead lanterns were shining. The electric train stopped and hissed as it opened thousands of doors. Now there was complete silence. The cold world froze, waiting for its test subject to make a move. Alexei stood in the vestibule in front of the open door, clutching an ice pick in his hand, unable to make a decision. The pause dragged on for an eternity. Stay or leave? What if there's no portal in the city? It's warm on the train, and they throw us food. What will happen in this concrete jungle? It's still unknown who lives there. Thoughts swarmed in his head, and doubts did not allow him to take a step. However, the electric train was also worse than bitter radish. It was better to disappear somewhere than to shake forever in this iron gut. Another link in the events helped Alexei make a choice. A ginger cat came out of the station building. the same one that the man had seen more than once at stations. The cat, reflecting the light of the lanterns with its eyes, walked calmly and confidently, heading straight for Alexei. "Well, how do you get here?" Alexei said thoughtfully, as if hoping for an answer. The ginger animal had already covered 3/4 of the station square, which lay between him and the electric train. Suddenly, 2 fierce dogs the size of half a bear jumped out of the same doors, followed by a healthy mutant. The brutality of the ginger cat was, of course, off the scale, but those 2 dunnets that rushed after him inspired simply quiet horror. In fact, they could not even be called dogs. There was something between a boar and an alibi. The owner of these beasts ran much slower, but looked no less creepy. The cat, looking for salvation, rushed like a bullet to the open doors, in which the only passenger was standing. Alexei, seeing the uniform of a law enforcement officer on the mutant, realized that nothing would stop them and they would pursue them to the end, pushing the doors from the vestibule into the carriage. Alexei for some reason shouted at the cat at the top of his lungs, "Here! Come here, Ginger!" The cat, as if understanding the call, literally flew into the carriage, and Alexei closed the doors. Then, without wasting time, he began to pound with an ice pick on the window that looked on the side opposite from the pursuers. A few blows with a steel tool and a good kick allowed the glass to be knocked out cleanly. At that moment, the dogs were already desperately growling and scratching at the sliding doors of the carriage. Their owner was approaching, and when he opened the doors, the beasts would rush at him without thinking. The cat did not wait for this moment, and was the first to jump into the broken window. Alexei had no choice but to follow him. The red one quickly ran across the rails to the nearest high-rise building. The man ran after him, and 2 bloodthirsty creatures were already jumping out through the broken window of the carriage. The red one darted into the first entrance. "He probably knows something," flashed through his head, and the man rushed there too. The entrance door was missing, but the apartments were tightly closed with powerful steel doors, on which some symbols were visible. The locked doors were causing panic. What if everyone in this building was locked? He didn't even want to think about it, and Alexei ran up the stairs. The 2nd floor, everyone was locked. The 3rd, the same picture. From below he could already hear the clicking of claws on the concrete steps and an angry growl. The man's hand tightened on the handle of the ice axe. The 4th floor, and luckily, one of the doors was slightly ajar. Alexei rushed to it, and throwing it open, ran into the room, then slammed it shut and grabbed the iron handle to hold the door closed. The metal door had no locks from the inside, so he had to rely only on his own strength. Fortunately, the doors opened outward, which meant the dogs wouldn't break through. But it was unknown whether their owner would come up here. Alexei had no chance against his strength. His pulse pounded in his temples like a machine gun burst. Alexei tried to breathe more quietly, but after such a run it was difficult. The semi-darkness did not allow him to look around and assess the situation, and there was no time for that now. The main thing was to freeze and not attract attention. The dogs rushed noisily higher. Either they had problems with their sense of smell, or the cat ran upstairs, and they were running along his scent. In any case, Alexei had not been noticed yet, and that was good. The man did not know how many floors the high-rise had, but the building was quite tall, and this fact gave him at least some head start to catch his breath and figure out what to do next. The possibility that the apartment might be inhabited was very unnerving. And right now from behind. No, he did not even want to think about it. The main thing was to behave as quietly as possible, but in extreme cases. The ice axe was lying under his feet. There were definitely 10 floors upstairs, plus there might be another open apartment, which meant there was a chance that the dogs would get stuck there for a long time. But he should not move away from the door. There was the 4th floor, and if something happened, he could end up trapped, because he could not jump out the window. Continuing to hold the door with his left hand, Alexei wiped the sweat from his face with his right palm and listened. At that moment, the creepy call of a mutant was heard from the street. A powerful ee, as if amplified by a megaphone, covered the entire city, bouncing off the walls of the high-rise buildings with multiple echoes. From somewhere above, a growing commotion was heard, and Alexei realized that the dogs heard their owner and immediately ran down. Ee sounded even louder over the strange city, and the dogs accelerated. Unable to cope with the inertia on the sharp turns of the stairwells, they slammed loudly against the doors of the apartments. The one Alexei was hiding behind got it too. Having left a dent in the metal, the dogs rushed out into the street. For another 5 minutes, the man did not let go of the door handle and listened. But everything was quiet. Absolutely quiet. The excitement subsided, his breathing was restored, and silence enveloped everything around. Picking up an ice pick from the floor, Alexei opened the door a little and looked out onto the landing. 3 adjacent doors were locked, the landing was empty. Suddenly, a light rustling sound was heard from the apartment behind him. Could it really be the owners? Flashed through his mind, and a chill ran down his spine. Clutching an ice pick, the man very slowly turned his head back. From the depths of the semi-dark room, 2 glowing eyes were looking at him. The pulse hit his temples again. But at that moment the sparkling eyes jumped to the floor and, uttering a creaking meow, the cat emerged from the shadows. Phew! You're something, Ginger! I almost threw an ice pick at you in fright. But how did you fool those creatures? They ran upstairs first. The cat slowly came closer, sat down on the floor and twitched his surviving ear, as if chasing away midges. I see. The man smiled. You can't drink away experience. By the way, my name is Alexei. And yours? Do you mind if I call you Ginger? The cat twitched his whiskers, sniffing. Well, that's great. Then show me the apartment. Why are you keeping me in the hallway? The new friend turned around and, raising his ginger tail like a pipe, led Alexei on a tour. The apartment had a more than strange appearance. All the windows were broken. There were no inhabitants, but there were traces of their presence. The furnishings were extremely aesthetic. In addition, the furnishings gave off some kind of caricature, as if there were movie sets around. The gas stove was out of gas, the sink was not connected to the water supply or sewerage system, and there was no water supply in sight. At the same time, there was a table in the middle of the kitchen, and on it was a plate of soup or some kind of stew frozen into ice. The red one jumped onto the table, clanked an aluminum spoon, touching it with his paw, businesslike sniffed the plate and snorted comically. A roughly knocked together stool lay on its side near the table, surrounded by used syringes, crushed ampoules, scraps of rubber tourniquet and dirty pieces of bandage. Apart from the kitchen, the apartment had only one room, and it looked similar. There was not a single piece of glass in the windows, and the only furnishings were a sagging old sofa, a table, a couple of chairs, and a wardrobe. There were syringes and broken ampoules on the floor again. A frosty breeze swayed scraps of bandages on the floor. The door to the balcony was wide open, and Alexei carefully went out to look around. The empty train station was clearly visible from the balcony. The train had left. But just a couple of hours ago, Alexei had no idea that he would be left in a strange, frozen city in the company of a ginger cat, and with completely unclear prospects. The moon flooded the empty areas with a crimson light and gleamed on the surviving glass facades. For a moment, the man felt like the master of an entire city. So what? After all, you can do whatever you want, go wherever you want, live in empty apartments. The main thing is not to catch the mutant's eye. Listen, Red, what's in the closed apartments? I see that their windows are intact, Alexei asked the cat, looking at the neighboring balcony. Instead of words, the cat jumped onto the railing and gracefully hopped onto the nearest balcony with intact glass in the windows. The balconies were no more than a meter apart, and it was not difficult for the cat to visit the neighbors. Aha! Are you suggesting that we check? Alexei appreciated the idea. The cat twitched his tail and, jumping onto the windowsill, marked the glass. Well, I see. Now this is your apartment too. Then I'm coming to you. Alexei climbed onto the railing and began to look for a place to step forward. The distance wasn't that great, but he didn't want to fall off the 4th floor either. Having taken a step over the abyss, the man found himself in front of a closed balcony door and a cloudy glass window through which nothing could be seen. The only way to get into the dark apartment was to break the glass. Well, Red, shall we make some noise? The cat twitched his ear. What if those creatures live there? Where are we going to run then? Alexei looked questioningly at his accomplice. The cat stretched and brazenly lay down on the windowsill. If only I had your confidence, the man grunted, hitting the glass of the balcony door with an ice pick. Having showered the balcony with an avalanche of shards, the newly minted burglar stuck his head inside and, looking around, muttered to the cat, "It's empty." Then, putting his hand in, he opened the door from the inside and entered the room. The redhead quickly darted underfoot and confidently ran to explore the unfamiliar living space. The uninhabited room greeted the guests with musty smells, the same Spartan furnishings as in the previous apartment. Nothing new, except that there was no garbage on the floor. Alexei had already relaxed and walked towards the kitchen, but turning into the corridor that led there, he literally froze in place. Someone was sitting at the table in the kitchen. The cat, also frozen at the entrance, stared at the strange figure. The picture would have looked quite mundane. The inhabitant of the apartment was having lunch in the kitchen. Only the inhabitant was a healthy mutant, and he did not move at all. Moments were counted in his temples with blows. But the owner of the apartment did not even stir. Sitting at the table, in front of the plate, he held a spoon in his hand and remained motionless, like a wax doll. The cat slowly and stealthily went to investigate. His soft paws barely touched the floor and did not make a single sound. Alexei, like the mutant, froze in place, except that he continued to breathe and blink his eyes. Red, pricking up all his 1.5 ears and ready to jump back at any second in case of trouble, came close to the leg of the sitting man and began to sniff it. When everything became clear to the cat, he snorted contemptuously and, having marked the mutant's leg, jumped onto the table like a proprietor. Red, is this a doll? The man whispered and, squeezing the ice pick tighter, carefully approached the inhabitant of the strange apartment. Touching the head of the frozen figure, Alexei pulled his hand back. Wow! This is not a doll. Red, this is a genuine frozen mutant. This is a mechanic. I've seen his kind before. Alexei's voice betrayed excitement. The situation really did look scary. Against the backdrop of the window, a frozen mutant in a dirty orange vest was sitting at the table. And apparently he froze instantly. The spoon was just a little short of his mouth, and his open, glassy eyes were staring into space. Red, this is a 2-room apartment. There's another room there. We should take a look at it. We don't need any surprises. But the cat sat down right on the table in front of the mechanic, having dinner, and began to lick himself. Okay. I'll have a look myself, Alexei muttered and headed to the bedroom. The cat had almost finished his hygiene procedures when Alexei returned. There's a broad in an orange vest lying on the bed, the same one freshly frozen. Probably that one's wife. The man nodded at the mechanic. Red paused and, having listened attentively, continued to wash himself. Listen, my hands are shaking. And I see that nothing can impress you. The cat's entire attention was riveted on a flea, which he was trying to catch with his teeth in his thick fur. Okay. I think you'll be interested in this. Throwing off his backpack, Alexei took out some sausage. The redhead immediately caught the smell of the meat product and, without getting off the table, meowed long and creaky, as if his vocal cords were a rusty door hinge. Yeah, it worked, Alexei smiled. But I don't really feel like having a picnic next to a frostbitten idol. So let's go into the hall, sir, the man said theatrically, emphasizing the word sir. Heading into the empty room. Sir didn't keep him waiting long and in one fell swoop found himself in the hall. Alexei sat down in an old cold armchair and, breaking the sausage in a brotherly manner, threw Rizzy's share on the floor. The cat greedily grabbed his piece and jumped onto the table with it. The man and the red cat had made camp in one of the high-rise buildings of a strange city, lost somewhere between worlds and populated by frozen mutants. Eternal night reigned over the city. And above the night was the moon. Listen, my friend, I see that you are a cultured cat. And you are not from this world, Alexei began, taking bread out of his backpack. Show me a portal to our world, and I promise to feed you sausage for the rest of your life. At the mention of sausage, Rizzy looked up from his meal and, licking his lips, looked at his interlocutor with his huge green eyes. I realized long ago that the moon reacts to the penetration of strangers into this world. Well, unless they got here via an electric train. As soon as you appear here, it turns red. And also these movements of yours between stations. You would never have overtaken the electric train on your own. Well, spill the beans, bro, where is the portal? Instead of answering, the cat jumped to the floor and, running out into the corridor, stared tensely at the iron entrance door. What's there? Did you hear something? Alexei jumped up from his chair, worried. The cat, listening, headed for the door. Alexei followed him on tiptoe. There was no peephole in the door, but there was a fairly large keyhole. It's good that the door is locked, was all the man had time to think, focusing his gaze through the keyhole. When a key was suddenly inserted into it from the other side, the man and the cat were literally taken aback by the surprise. Click! The mechanism of the lock turned with the sound of a machine gun bolt, and time seemed to slow down. Click! Another turn, breaking the absolute silence. And there were absolutely no thoughts in his head. Where to run? Where to hide? Click! Out of the corner of his eye, Alexei caught how the cat darted into the open bathroom, and, without thinking, rushed after him, carefully closing the door behind him. The friends locked themselves in a semi-dark room with a latch. The door in the hallway creaked open and heavy footsteps were heard. Apparently, there were 2 guests, and they headed for the kitchen. Past the flimsy door, behind which a man and a cat were hiding, barely breathing. In addition to the booming stomping, the prisoners of the combined bathroom heard other sounds. As if someone or something was being dragged along the floor. Then all the action concentrated on the kitchen. A metallic ringing, then a click, followed by a hum like from a transformer and a bright glow. The bathroom had a small window, almost under the ceiling, which looked out onto the kitchen. It was through it that a strange flickering light penetrated, illuminating the cramped space. The businesslike fuss and hum of the appliance in the kitchen gave hope that a search of the apartment was not part of the visitors' plans. Alexei felt his fear receding and curiosity taking over. Believing that the noise behind the wall would drown out his careful movements, he carefully climbed onto the peeling edge of the cast-iron bathtub and peered through the dusty glass into the kitchen. The man had seen a lot during the time he spent in the ghostly electric train, but what was happening in the next room literally shook him. Next to the mechanic, frozen on the chair, there was now a device that looked like a powerful heat emitter with a cone-shaped reflector. The device directed all its energy in the form of radiation directly at the frozen owner of the apartment, and he began to slowly warm up. Streams literally ran off him, like from a snowman in the scorching sun. At the opposite end of the table stood a huge mutant in a dirty, worn-out medical coat, busily filling several syringes with some kind of murky muck from previously opened ampoules. Next to him, Kneeling right on the floor, a second giant in a white coat was assembling a device resembling a defibrillator. What is this? Resuscitation? A completely wild guess flashed through Alexei's mind. It was hard to imagine a stranger picture. In the flickering light of the emitter, two creepy medics were preparing to resuscitate a mechanic who had been frozen for God knows how long. The hand with the spoon was the first to thaw. It went limp and slammed onto the table with such a crash that Alexei almost fell off the bathtub in surprise. The plate shattered into pieces, and the spoon fell to the floor with a clang. The rest of the mechanic remained motionless and, like a profusely sweating statue, continued to sit with its mouth open, from which melted liquid was also dripping. The big guy with the syringes immediately approached the mechanic, and with a nasty crunch stuck the needle of a huge syringe straight into the patient's limp shoulder. With visible effort, he injected the cloudy dose and threw the syringe to the floor. After the injection, the fingers of the thawed hand trembled and began tapping out Morse code on the surface of the table. The sight was impressive. The body was still frozen in ice, but the hand was already moving. Next, the mutant's neck thawed, and the heavy head literally fell onto his chest. The injection into the neck followed immediately. When the limp mechanic slid to the floor, a medic with a defibrillator got to work. Having quickly wiped the puddle off the floor, he applied 2 contacts to the patient's chest and applied voltage. The body jumped half a meter, and smoke came out from under the electrodes. Then came injections directly into the heart and another discharge. Without any ceremony with the man lying on the floor, the two either slapped him across the cheeks or tried to revive him with electricity. The smell of burnt meat hung in the air. Alexei felt himself starting to feel sick from what he saw. Suddenly the mechanic sat up abruptly on the floor and, his eyes bulging, screamed so loudly that the glass in the windows vibrated. His pupils wandered chaotically, and his chest, smoking from the electrodes, took its first breath. "This is unbelievable," whispered the shocked Alexei, continuing to watch what was happening. The 2 men in lab coats began to roll up the equipment, turned off the lamp, and roughly lifting their patient to his feet, strode toward the exit. The mechanic, staggering like a zombie and continuing to roll his eyes, obediently followed them. The front door slammed loudly, and the sounds of the lock being locked were replaced by the booming stomping of the medics and their patient going downstairs. Alexei climbed down to the floor on weak legs. "Red, where are you?" the man called to his friend. "It's good that you didn't see this horror. As far as I understand, they use the frozen ones like spare tires. If a mutant dies somewhere, these bastards just come to one of the houses and resuscitate the one they need as a replacement. This city is like a labor bank." The disheveled cat, sniffing anxiously, slowly crawled out from under the bathtub. "Listen, buddy, we need to get out of here. Otherwise, soon you and I will be tasting that woman lying in the bedroom." "You don't want that, do you?" the cat snorted contemptuously. "Then lead us to the portal. I understand that you are afraid to go outside, but we must do it." The red cat nervously twitched his tail and headed for the balcony. Alexei followed him. To leave the house, the friends had to do the whole thing in reverse order. First, jump onto the balcony of an empty apartment, then down the steps, and there it was, the entrance. "They don't even close the empty apartments," flashed through Alexei's mind as he went out onto the landing. The cat stopped at the corner of the building and began to carefully examine the station, which was about 200 meters away. The electric train had long since left, and the way was clear. "The portal is there? Right at the station?" Alexei asked without taking his eyes off the building. The cat's spine bristled with a red ridge of fur. Apparently, he remembered the dogs that lived there. "Okay, friend, don't worry. We'll try to slip through unnoticed," the man encouraged the cat, clutching an ice pick in his hand. The red cat twitched his tail and tore across the rails. Alexei, trying to make as little noise as possible, ran after him. Having overcome a series of railroad tracks, the man and the cat, listening intently, froze at the end wall of the station. It was quiet around. It seemed that their dash had gone unnoticed. This was good news. Having made sure that there was no trouble, the cat walked along the foundation to the ventilation window, which, judging by the warm and musty exhaust, led to the basement. Here he sniffed carefully, analyzing the airflow from the dungeon for the presence of dangerous odors and, not finding any, darted straight into the window. Alexei had no choice but to follow his guide, rightly believing that if the cat had jumped, it meant it was not far to the floor. The man, having first removed his backpack, squeezed through the narrow opening and found himself in a damp room under the station. A pair of eyes shining in the darkness ahead signaled that Red was waiting for his clumsy partner. Alexei clicked the flashlight button and looked around. A typical basement of an abandoned building. Everything was as it should be: dampness, cobwebs, and rusty pipes. The cat confidently walked along the main line, consisting of 5 or 6 pipes of different sizes. Alexei hurried after him, passing through doorways from one gloomy room to another. It seemed that the series of concrete rooms would never end. The bundle of pipes occasionally turned to the right and then to the left. But Reedy confidently walked along it. Finally, the cat led Alexei to a blank wall and stopped at the place where the pipes passed right through it. A wide opening was provided in the concrete for the pipeline, but apparently after the communications were laid, the opening was filled with brickwork and the gap between the pipes was only enough for the cat to squeeze through, but not for a person. On the damp red brick there was a circle with 3 arrows converging at the center. "So we're going there?" Alexei recognized the red mark. The redhead blinked one eye knowingly and, deftly jumping onto the pipes, squeezed through the crack to the other side. "No, you're certainly a smart one," the man said with feigned annoyance. "But I'll have to make some noise." The masonry was very old, and the bricks were crumbling badly. Nevertheless, it took some vigorous waving of the ice pick before a hole was formed through which Alexei could crawl. Red was honestly waiting for his friend on the other side of the wall. When the friends reunited, the cat immediately continued on his way. There was the same basement behind the wall, only it had become much warmer. Alexei unbuttoned his overalls and touched the pipes. They were still cold. After some time of wandering, the cat led Alexei out of the basement into an abandoned boiler room. The old gates were wide open to the street, revealing the starry sky. Not far from the entrance, a fire was burning, next to which someone was sitting. The cat boldly approached the figure by the fire. "AAA Baydar, it's you. Where have you been? I saved you some fish. Spats and tomato sauce, just like you like." Alexei froze in place. A man was sitting by the fire. Yes. It was definitely a man, and he was happy to see the cat as if it were his friend. He even called him by name. Alexei, holding his breath, walked out of the boiler room and approached the fire. "Hello," the stranger addressed Alexei. "Come sit by the fire. There is enough room for everyone." "Where are you from?" The interlocutor was an old man with a gray beard, in a rumpled jacket, and the same rumpled trousers. Alexei was dumbfounded and did not know what to answer. He was standing in a winter jumpsuit on the green grass, and the trees around him were rustling with leaves. The ice axe fell out of the man's hand. "Where are we?" was all he could wheeze, staring around. "This is the 666th kilometer. A station like this. There is a depot and a large railway junction here. And who are you?" Alexei turned his gaze to the old man. "Me? Basically a homeless person. I live in this abandoned boiler room." Alexei plopped down on the ground and plucked a tuft of green grass, then, looking completely stunned, brought it to his nose, inhaled noisily and said as he exhaled, "Grass, well, yes. There was a lot of rain this summer, that's why the grass is juicy," the old man explained. On a moonlit summer night, at the 666th kilometer station, a strange company was sitting around a fire near an abandoned boiler room. A young man in a winter suit, a homeless old man, and a ginger cat. The man was gradually coming to his senses, realizing that he had somehow managed to return to his world after a terrible voyage through the vastness of another reality. The horizon was already turning crimson behind him, and any minute now he was about to meet a star called the sun. A star that he had not seen for too long. The end. Thanks for listening.